Welcome to my new series, Decks of the Week. I know, a very creative and original title. Every Sunday I aim to cover 8 standard decks that caught my attention, whether they be budget lists for people who want to experience the new set but are short on wildcards, builds that recently hit Mythic, or just looked like a fun idea. If you're interested in how the decks actually performed on the latter, I also choose one each week to run 50 matches for my Saturday showcase. I'd like it as an honest approach, since I hate it when content creators make a deck look better than it actually is, since wildcards are precious. If you have an idea for a deck, or a brew of your own, I'd love to hear from you. You can post the list in the comments below or in my Discord, or let me know what you think about the builds. What's your favorite? What would you add or change to make these lists more competitive? I love discussing cards and sharing my love for Magic the Gathering, and before I forget, I publish multiple videos every week, so remember to hit like and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. With that, here are my top 8 standard decks for week 3 of Wilds of Eldraine. Number 1 is Rakdos Sacrifice by astralsflame, who is an amazing Magic the Gathering player, and I blame them entirely for me being called Astral all too often. They piloted this list into Mythic in Best of 3. Sacrifice decks aim to create cheap permanents later for that you can sacrifice later for value. The key enablers or fodder producers are Voldaren Epicure, a 1/1 for 1 that when it enters the battlefield deals 1 damage to each opponent and creates a blood token. So the token artifact you can use to loot or you can use to sacrifice later. And we also have Blood Tithe Harvester. Blood Tithe Harvester is a 3/2 for black and a red that when it enters the battlefield it also creates a blood token. And then you can use it to remove a creature. It gets -X, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control. So before you sacrifice the blood tokens for your loops later in the game, you can use it to remove something with Blood Tithe Harvester. And lastly, we got Hopeless Nightmare, which enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. And then when it is put into a graveyard, which you can easily do, so you won't have to pay the 3 to sacrifice it, you get to trigger Scry 2. So all of these create an effect as well as a permanent that you can sacrifice. And then we use the fodder for the payoffs, and this deck has several. First up is Ob Nixilis, the Adversary. It creates a copy if you can sacrifice a creature when you cast it. And then we have Braids. Braids Arisen Nightmare, which is really good for triggering your sacrifices and is a great value engine because your opponent will have to choose whether or not to sacrifice along with you or let us draw more cards. Oni Cult Anvil is the cornerstone of the deck, in my opinion, since it creates additional fodder, further enabling your future sacrifices while also being a win condition as you slowly sap them for 1 damage each turn. And what would a Rakdos deck be without the old Steal and Sack strategy? Furnace Rains takes your opponent's biggest threat, turns it against them, maybe even makes a treasure token for additional sacrifice fodder, and then you can sacrifice their creature after combat. The deck is also running 4 copies of Annihilating Glare, which is a great removal, especially when you have a whole bunch of things to sacrifice. And then we've also got Rankle's Prank, which looks like it would be a even effect, right? Because it would hit both players equally, but it hardly ever is actually equal. And especially with Hopeless Nightmare, you can really hate on their hand, which comes in handy when you're playing up against control. And then we've got Beseech the Mirror, which is a good tutor effect. And you have ample targets to pay for the bargain, so you can tutor for anything in your deck and put it into play. Number 2 is another best of 3 list that recently hit Mythic. This one is Gruul Ramp by Carlo Favretto Jr., aka CFav, an amazing Twitch streamer, and he has a wonderful community, so if you haven't checked him out, I highly recommend that you do. This deck combines the ramp of green and the aggressiveness of red. The key enablers are the rampers, like Bramble Familiar, a 2/2 for 2 that can tap for 1 green, and then 1 and a green to tap, discard a card, return Bramble Familiar to its owner's hand. And what's nice about this is that it's also a late game threat. So you can use the fetch, quest, adventure side and hit one of your big bombs that you're trying to aim to ramp to. So it's nice that your ramp, it plays well in the early game as well as the late game. And then we've got Charming Scoundrel, which is a new card from Wilds of Eldraine that is a 1/1 that can, when it comes into play, you create a treasure token to help ramp, or you can discard a card, then draw a card if you need to smooth out, you're not finding your lands. Or lastly, but what you use mostly in aggro, is create a Wicked Roll and then attach that to target creature you control. And then we've got Topiary Stomper, which is an amazing piece of ramp. It comes in as a 4/4 vigilance for 3, but it can't attack or block until you control 7 or more lands. But it puts the card the basic land card that you search for into the battlefield tapped. And then we've also got even more ramp. We've got Gwynna, Eyes of Gaia, which is a 2/3 for 3 that taps for 2 mana, and you can spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activated abilities. What's nice that it's rainbow mana. And then whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Gwynna and untap it, so you can even do it again. But these cards that ramp for 2 are especially nice to get to your top end. And the other one that ramps for 2 as well is Invasion of Zendikar, which is a battle that comes in when it enters the battlefield. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And then if you feel like it, you can spend 3 damage to flip it into Awakened Skyclave, which is a 4/4 vigilance haste. And as long as Awakened Skyclave is on the battlefield, it's a land in addition to its other types, and it can tap as a ramper as well. So after all of these wonderful bits of ramp, we're looking to play big creatures, and this one's one of the top big creatures to play. It's an 8/8 that cannot be countered, that has Trample, Ward 4, and Haste, as well as Toxic 4, because why not, right? And we've also got a couple of other big payoffs, like Atali Primal Conqueror is a 7/7 trample. When it enters the battlefield, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, and then you get to cast those cards for free. So it's like a 3-for-1 card in one card. It doesn't have haste, but you get immediate value from when it enters the battlefield. And then because you have so much ramp, you might even be able to transform it into Atali Primal Sickness, which is an 11/11 trample indestructible creature. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many poison counters. So just an absolutely huge threat. And then we also have Gruff Triplets. Gruff Triplets is 3 3/3s with trample in 1 card. This is a new one from Wilds of Eldraine and is a top performer in Limited, so I'm curious to see how it does in Constructed. There might be too many wraths for it to really do the thing, but if they destroy it one at a time, it continues to grow your other Gruff Triplets until you're left with a 12/12. So very, very good threat as well. Number 3 is also a best of 3 Mythic deck list. This one was made by WKLMTG. It's Golgari Midrange, which if you've been playing the game for a while like me, you might know as the Rock. It has gotten a lot of recent attention and has a lot of potential to be a top performer in the new meta. We're looking to leverage powerful threats, card advantage, and efficient removal to win the game. Wilds of Eldraine gave us the Mosswood Dread Knight, which is a 3/2 trampler for 2, and it is a built-in 2-for-1 since you can play it for its adventure side first, and then if it can be a 4-for-1 if you get to take advantage of Dread Knight's on death ability even just once. We've also got Tenacious Underdog, which is a staple. It's a replayable 3/2 for 2 mana that can also draw your cards later with its Blitz ability. Both of these are great for mid-range decks because they're multifunctional creatures that generate value. And we've got Graveyard Trespasser, which is a staple that many will be familiar with. It's a 3/3 with a built-in protection that requires a 2-for-1 to get rid of, and it gives you a little bit of graveyard hate. And then we've also got Glissa Sunslayer, which has basically been just sitting around waiting for Golgari to get good, and offers another way to generate card advantage. And the First Strike plus Death Touch makes her a top quality blocker or attacker. And then what would any black deck be without our baby Sheoldred the Apocalypse? Sheoldred, it's just the big bad of the format. She's a win condition on her own, and she also has synergies with the card draw from the Dread Whispers, the adventure side of Moss Dread Knight, Tenacious Underdog, and Glissa Sunslayer. For interaction, we have Liliana of the Veil. And since we're aiming to draw a lot and have several 2-for-1s, the mutual discard from the uptick hurts our opponent more than us, and her ability to -2 is especially good if we face a single creature. Cut Down is a old staple. It removes early threats for just 1 mana, and then we also have Go for the Throat. Still performing quite well. It removes your enemy's Sheoldred or Godric for just 2 mana. And then we have Virtue of Persistence, which is really good removal against aggressive decks because it gains you life, but it is also an amazing late game threat. And it allows you to bring back any creature, not just from your graveyard, on your upkeep, so you should be able to eventually overwhelm your opponent. Number 4 is a best of 1 deck list by Riccardo Antonini that went 6-3 and 7-0 in back-to-back standard events. I don't recommend doing the standard events since I dislike the payout structure, but if you can reliably hit 6 or 7 wins, then you can use it to farm gold. Rakdos Aggro takes the core of the red aggro deck, so we've got Kumano faces Kakazan, one of the best performing red uncommons in standard. Monastery Swiftspear, which is a 1/2 haste with prowess. We've got the Charming Scoundrel, which is seeing more and more play in red decks. Really great, very versatile card, and can ramp with by creating treasure. It can be just a 2/2 with a Wicked roll, so it pings for 1 when it dies, or it triggers a Rummage if you need that last minute top deck. We've got Bloodthirsty Adversary, which I'm a little bit surprised to see Bloodthirsty Adversary in this list because it is running only 21 lands, and I find Bloodthirsty Adversary to be better when you can play it for a 5-drop, so it comes down as a 3/3 that lets you replay a spell that costs 3 or less from your graveyard. So I'm really curious about how this will play, and maybe it should be a different 2-drop. For example, we have, or maybe even multiple copies of, like another copy of Godric. We've got Godric is making more and more of an appearance. Since it is a legendary, usually you see it capped at 3 instead of at 4. But it can become a Shivan Dragon if you trigger a celebration. So you get a 4/4 flyer with fire breathing. And we've also got Feldon. Feldon's a staple, and it's a 2/2 haste that can't block, but whenever it's dealt damage, it lets you dig for answers. And we also are playing Invasion of Regatha, and Invasion of Regatha works really well with Feldon. So maybe we could try tweaking like the 2 Bloodthirsty Adversaries down for 2 Feldons, because you can ping your own Feldon for 1 damage and trigger a dig, as well as hitting them in the face for 4 damage. So I think there's a lot of synergies specifically with Feldon and Invasion of Regatha. It could be kind of fun to explore. And we've also got the why are we actually playing black then, right? And what we're trying to do is we're accepting increased mana variance to play some of the better removal, and this is basically a black shock if you look at it that way, right? That also makes your opponent discard a card. So Hopeless Nightmare, very curious to see how this one plays, and then it can also give us some late game scry if we needed it, if it gets into the top deck stage. And then we've also got Okiba Reckoner Raid, which pings the opponent for 2 damage before it comes into play as a 2/2 menace. And then we've got Candy Grapple, and this, so we could bargain the Hopeless Nightmare away to give something -5/-5. And the -3/-3 and -5/-5 works really well with a lot of what I've been seeing in Standard, like Shieldred has 5 toughness, and then Godric is a 3/3 before it triggers Celebration. So it should line up pretty nicely against our opponent's threats. And then we've also got 1 copy of Go for the Throat, and which is the black staple removal that destroys target non-artifact creature. And both black removal spells can be brought back by Bloodthirsty Adversary, so maybe we do want to include Bloodthirsty Adversary and just tweak the land count up a little bit. It's going to have to, I'd have to play it to really explore it, or it might just work perfectly the way it is. You never know, right? So that it's a little bit of a stretch, though, to reliably be like, okay, we're going to hit our black removal spells on 5 with this, but it's still an interesting combination that this deck is running. And one thing that I did note is that the ratio of creatures to spells is a little bit dramatic. We have 13 creatures to 23 spells, which makes me worried about having a handful of removal and no way to deal repeatable damage. But the list certainly caught my attention. Okay, number 5 is a best of 3 Mythic deck list by Moth. Mono-white humans was a top-performing archetype before the release of Wilds of Eldraine, and early data suggests that it is still the top performer, at least in best of 1. So this list is running the usual culprits centered around Coppercoat Vanguard, which is the 2/2, each other human you control gets +1/+0 and has Ward 1. And what's nice about these is that they stack on top of each other. So if you get multiples into play, it could be a real hassle for your opponent. And then we also have Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, the 2/1 first strike that makes your opponent's spells cost 1 more to cast. The synergy just between these 2 cards alone wins games. Then we've got Recruitment Officer, a 2/1 for 1 that can dig to almost every card in our deck. Hopeful Initiate, which is a 1/2 with training that can grow into an absolutely large threat, especially when it's protected by Thalia and Coppercoat. We've also got Skrelv, which, if it survives a round, it has to be the target of your opponent's next removal, because you can just tap it. Even if you don't have mana, you can do the Phyrexian pay 2 life to give something hexproof. And then we've also got Spellbook Vendor, which is a new card from Wilds of Eldraine that is sort of like a Luminarch Aspirant, but because it gives you a sorcerer roll, you can't have more than 1 roll at a time on a creature. But you can still end up giving your whole board slowly +1/+1, and the sorcerer roll does trigger a scry when the creature attacks. We've got Intrepid Adversary, which is a 3/1 lifelink for 2, that if you pay in multiples of 1 and a white, you give your entire board +1/+1. I found it to be very handy against the mono red. Lifelink can be really what saves you against dying to the aggro decks. But usually you're not going to play it on 2, so it kind of acts as the deck's 4-drop. And Brutal Cathar is wonderful. It's a creature that you develop the board while also removing your opponent's creature, and if you target something like a token, then it's never going to come back. And if the day-night cycle, it flips into a 3/3 first strike, but do note that it is a werewolf on the backside and not a human, so it will lose the synergies with Coppercoat. And then we've got Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, just an absolutely great threat in mono-white decks. And then whenever so her power is equal to the number of creatures you control, but whenever you attack, and she's got vigilance, so she's also good on defense, but you spawn a 1/1 human that will get the buffs if you have Coppercoat Vanguard in play. So you can absolutely just overrun your opponent. And then we've got, let's see here, we've only 1 copy of Knight Errant of Eos, which I think kind of makes sense because we used to have more of these, as the meta's definitely sped up. So since the meta is going faster, we have less of time to use like the 3 to convoke to go dig or multiple threats from Knight Errant of Eos. And also because of Spellbook Vendor, we already have an increased way of digging through our deck. So I think cutting down to 1 Knight Errant of Eos makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, we've got 2 copies of Ossification, which is really useful to remove problematic threats like Planeswalkers or an enemy Shieldred. Number 6 is the first place winner of the Standard Challenge on September 17th, so it is a best of 3 list. It is Domain Ramp by HandsomePPZ. It's running Bramble Familiar, which we've seen before in the Gruul Ramp deck, but you'll notice that it is not running Invasion of Alara, which is why I refuse to call the Domain Ramp deck the Alara deck. Bramble Familiar ramps us early in the game, but is also a powerful late-game threat because of the adventure side. It's also running Invasion of Zendikar and Topiary Stomper that we saw in the Gruul ramp deck as well. So just really good at getting to our late-game threats. And then we've also got Courier Briefcase, which I really like. I've seen it in several Domain ramp lists. It creates a 1/1 that you can use to block and slow down your opponent's early aggression. And then, since we're playing so many different land types, being able to tap for any 1 mana of any color has been helpful for fixing. And the payoff to playing the full plethora of Domain really is Leyline Binding. This is just like, it's usually a 1-cost removal spell that you can play at instant speed because it has flash. And you can hit any non-land permanent, so you can get rid of Planeswalkers. And then the other thing, too, that's a nice synergy for this deck specifically is this one's running 2 copies of Chromehost Seed Shark. So whenever you cast a non-creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. So if you do a Leyline Binding for 1 mana, it still counts as a 6-cost, and it will trigger a 6/6 incubator token. So that's kind of a fun time. And then we've got the... where's Archangel of Wrath. Is this one? Yeah, I was like, where is it? I was looking at the 6 drops because you usually pay the kicker. So Archangel of Wrath is wonderful against early aggressive decks. It is a 3/4 flyer with lifelink that if you pay the kicker of a black and or the kicker for red, you also get to deal 2 damage to any target, and that damage will have lifelink. So 4 life when it comes into play, and then later a 3/4 lifelinker. It's just, this is a huge problem against mono red. Whenever I'm up against the Domain ramps, you just have to try to win the game before they get to playing their Archangel of Wrath. And then we've also got 1 copy of Drag to the Bottom, which I thought was an interesting inclusion, since it's being played over a 3rd Sunfall, and it can be used as a 1-sided board wipe. So if you're careful about which lands you play, you might be able to give everything -3/-3 and leave your Archangel behind, for example. And 1-sided board wipes are absolutely disgusting if you can pull it off. But the typical route is just to try to get to 5 mana as soon as possible, and whatever your opponent has played early, you then use Sunfall to exile and just start everything from scratch, and know that your late-game threats are going to take over the game. And speaking of late-game threats that take over the game, there really isn't a better option than Atraxa. Atraxa is a 7/7 flying, vigilance, death touch, lifelinker that grabs a bunch of cards from your deck. And this this list is running the 4 copies of Virtue of Persistence. That removal is really good against the aggressive decks as well. But we don't really have any like big scores to plan to put Atraxa into the graveyard. But if Atraxa dies from your opponent's removal, you can use it to bring Atraxa back. But the main plan is to hard cast Atraxa from our hand. And we have 1 copy of the Herd Migration, which is you can cycle it for 2 to search your library for a basic land card and gain 3 life, which sometimes you just have to do, especially against the early aggressive decks. And then it has Domain, create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each basic land type among lands you control. And this is really nice if your opponent has played the End on your Atraxa or on your Archangel, and you need an alternative win condition. So I like this as a 1-of. And the last thing to mention is Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. So this is another kind of like, it's a little cheeky, I think, but the idea is that permanents entering the battlefield cause a triggered ability of a permanent to trigger twice, and it stops your opponent. So if they are trying to play a hard cast Atraxa, then their Atraxa does nothing when it enters, and our Atraxa triggers twice. So fun to see if that will work as kind of just a one-of. Number 7 is the second place winner of the Standard Challenge and is a Sultai midrange best of 3 list by SoulStrong. It's a bit of a stretch to call it Sultai if we don't look at the sideboard, since the only main deck blue card is Spell Pierce. But being able to block your opponent's Wrath is probably worth the hassle in a deck that otherwise is the Golgari midrange deck. So we've covered it earlier. It's got the Mosswood Dread Knight. It's got the underdogs. It doesn't have the it does. It has the 2 Graveyard Trespassers and the Glissa Sunslayer, and Shieldred the Apocalypse. Cut down, go for the throat. So this is kind of a repeat of what we covered before, and also Virtue of Persistence. So. They did decide to include a couple of different cards, though. One is Lord Skitter Sewer King, which was being explored early on in the meta to figure out if it's a good mid-range threat. And, a 3/3 that spawns a 1/1 rat and exiles the opponent's graveyard at the beginning of each combat on your turn is probably worth checking out. The other thing, too, is Blossoming Tortoise. I've seen a couple of people playing around with, the Draconic enchantment that gives you fire breathing but colorless, so you can hit for infinite damage. This deck is not running that combo, but I'm starting to see Blossoming Tortoise pop up in interesting places. It's a hill giant. It's a 3/3 for 4, but when it enters the battlefield, it mills 3 cards, and then you return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And you also have the activated abilities of lands you control cost 1 less to cast, as well as get +1/+1, which is important for the Golgari midrange deck because we are running Restless Cottage. And Restless Cottage is a great man land, especially when it comes in as a 5/5 for 3 and creates a food token and exiles more stuff from the graveyard every single time that it attacks. And we also have 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animist. And this one, curious to see how this one goes, because you can... it's a nice payoff to ramping with Tortoise. And it helps push our mid-range threats. If we do get to Ultimate, we can play this immediately Ultimate, so it could be a good way to give all of our creatures trample. And number 8 is the 3rd place winner of the Standard Challenge and is a mono red aggro best of 3 list by Geleroff. Doing my best. Sorry if I screwed up your name. It's very similar to the list that took first place the week before on September 10th that I covered in week 1 by Daniel Akos. It's running 4 Monastery Swiftspears, the 1/2 of Prowess, 2 Phoenix Chicks instead of 3. We've got 4 Charming Scoundrels instead of 3. We've got 3 Bloodthirsty Adversaries instead of 4. 1 Feldon instead of 2. And 3 Godric. I like this change. 3 Godric instead of 2. And then we've got 3 Squeeze, which is, it's nice. I like Squee, especially if we're going to be going for a little bit of a later mono red list. And then we've got the classic Burn, which is play with fire, deals 2 damage and can scry, lightning strike, and we're not running a copy of the Convoke spell, which I think is a good change for the consistency if we're going to lean into the Bloodthirsty Adversary. But one of the things that it did include that we haven't seen, or that the other list didn't have, was Monstrous Rage, and I've been very impressed with this in the Is It Aggro deck that I will be that I showcased yesterday on YouTube. And of course, we've got the Nahiri's Warcrafting, which we can use with Bloodthirsty Adversary to remove the opponent's Shieldred, and then we've got Kumano faces Kakazan. And the list is still running 23 lands as well, which I like if we are going to include the Bloodthirsty Adversary. I do think it needs a little bit more land. It's got 3 Mishra's Foundries, which I think I want to see 2 instead of 3. It really depends on how many control matchups you're coming up against. And then only 1 Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance instead of 2, and 19 Mountains instead of 18. So I hope you enjoyed the episode on decks of the week and are as excited as I am to give them a try. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more weekly Magic content. It's a free way to help me out and bring my content to new people. I really appreciate it. And if you're new to the game or new to my community, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Discord or leave a comment below if you have any questions. I enjoy helping people with the game that I have played and loved for over 25 years. So good luck with your games, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.